What if the most powerful medicine your body has ever needed wasn't sitting in a pharmacy? It was sitting in a bowl. What if it was prepared thousands of years ago over open fires by people who had no hospitals, no supplements, no chronic disease epidemics, and somehow lived harder and healthier than most people do today with every modern advantage available to them? Modern science keeps arriving late to the party. Anti-inflammatory compounds and roots they dried every autumn. Prebiotic fibers in seeds they harvested by hand from wild rivers. Blood sugar regulation from trees growing in deserts that scientists are only now studying in clinical trials. The research keeps confirming the same thing. They already knew. They had always known. Stick around because number 7 on this list was carried into battle across thousands of miles of open plains. 3 ingredients, no refrigeration, no cooking required, and sports scientists are now calling it one of the most metabolically efficient endurance foods ever documented. And number 9, this one is the one that stopped me completely. It comes from a plant most people yank out of their garden as a weed. And it contains a compound that clinical researchers are now studying for its ability to reverse inflammatory damage at the cellular level. If you want ancestral nutrition backed by real science, delivered straight to you every single week, subscribe right now and hit that bell. You're not going to want to miss what's coming. Let's get into it. Here are 10 Native American meals that will heal you instantly. Ranked from extraordinary to absolutely life-changing. Number 1. Three Sisters Stew. Let's start exactly where every conversation about indigenous food on this continent should start. Corn, beans, squash. The Three Sisters. This wasn't a recipe. It was a worldview. A philosophy of interdependence built into the soil itself. The corn grew tall and gave the beans a ladder to climb. The beans pulled nitrogen from the air and returned it to the earth, feeding everything around them. The squash spread wide, its broad leaves forming a living canopy that kept the soil moist and locked out weeds. 3 completely different plants. One shared system. Nothing wasted. Everything served. And when you put them in a pot together, the nutritional engineering is just as precise. Corn delivers complex carbohydrates and sustained energy. Beans supply the protein and the specific amino acids that corn is missing. Squash floods the bowl with beta-carotene, vitamin C, and soluble fiber. Together, they form a complete protein, the kind of food combining sophistication that modern dietitians study for years. Indigenous grandmothers figured it out through centuries of watching what kept people strong. The fiber interaction in this stew is what modern gut health researchers get excited about. Soluble fiber from the beans, insoluble fiber from the corn, pectin from the squash. 3 different fiber types moving through the digestive system at 3 different speeds, feeding different communities of gut bacteria, stabilizing blood sugar, reducing post-meal inflammation in a cascade that no individual ingredient could trigger alone. Clinical research on high-fiber legume-based diets consistently shows reduced cardiovascular risk, improved glycemic control, and measurable improvements in microbiome diversity. The Three Sisters were not just inseparable as crops. In the bowl, they were medicine. Separately, they were just food. Number 2. Cedar-planked salmon. The Pacific Northwest nations did not need clinical trials to understand what salmon did to a human body. They watched the bears. They watched what happened to the rivers that had salmon versus the ones that didn't. They built entire ceremonial traditions around the first salmon of the season because they recognized, at a level deeper than science could yet explain, that this fish was not ordinary food. Cedar plank salmon, slow-cooked over open cedar wood, is one of the most nutritionally precise preparations in any food culture on Earth. The cedar doesn't just add flavor. It releases compounds called thujoplicins, natural antimicrobials, that infuse the flesh during cooking. And the slow, low heat of cedar plank cooking preserves the omega-3 fatty acids rather than oxidizing them the way high-heat frying does. Those omega-3s, EPA and DHA, are now among the most heavily researched compounds in all of nutritional medicine. DHA constitutes a significant portion of brain cell membranes. EPA drives the body's anti-inflammatory cascade from the inside out. Regular fatty fish consumption is consistently associated with dramatically lower rates of depression, cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, and inflammatory conditions of almost every category studied. Wild Pacific salmon, the salmon these nations ate, carries omega-3 profiles roughly twice as dense as farm salmon. They were cooking the right fish with the right wood, using the right technique for thousands of years before any of us had the molecular vocabulary to explain why it worked. Some wisdom doesn't need a mechanism to be real, but it is deeply satisfying when the science finally arrives and confirms it. Number 3. Bison bone broth stew. At its peak, 60 million bison moved across North America. For the Lakota, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, and dozens of other Plains nations, the bison was not livestock. It was the center of the entire world. Food, shelter, tools, ceremony. Every part of every animal was used. The idea of waste was not just impractical. It was unthinkable. And from a nutritional standpoint, this was not inefficiency dressed up as culture. It was advanced medicine. Bison is significantly leaner than modern industrial beef. But leanness is not the story. The fatty acid profile is the story. Grass-fed, wild-ranging bison carries a far more favorable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio than grain-finished beef. This matters in ways most people never think about because the chronic inflammation driving most modern disease, heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, metabolic syndrome, is fed in large part by the extreme omega-6 dominance in the Western diet. Bison stew was built with root vegetables, wild turnips, prairie onions, sometimes thickened with chokecherries for antioxidants. But the most important part happened in the pot, over hours. The slow extraction of collagen and gelatin from the bones. The same gut-healing, joint-rebuilding compounds that modern bone broth companies now sell at premium prices were simply the baseline of daily eating for Plains peoples across centuries. This was nose-to-tail nutrition before anyone made a trend. The whole animal, cooked slowly in a pot with wild plants, producing a meal that built strength, healed injury, and sustained endurance across distances that would exhaust most people today. Number 4. Wild rice and herb soup. Here is something most people have never been told. Wild rice is not rice. It is not even a grain in the botanical sense. It is a semi-aquatic grass seed, Zizania palustris, harvested from lakes and rivers across the Great Lakes region for thousands of years by the Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe peoples. They called it manumin, the good berry. Its harvest was a sacred communal event that organized the entire autumn season. Modern food science has looked at wild rice and been genuinely surprised. For something growing wild in a lake, the protein content is exceptional, nearly double that of white rice. It carries meaningful levels of magnesium, zinc, and phosphorus. It contains antioxidant compounds including ferulic acid and trypsin, both of which show documented anti-inflammatory and potential anti-cancer properties in laboratory research. Wild rice soup, simmered with fresh herbs, seasonal vegetables, whatever the land and season offered, is one of those meals that heals across multiple systems at the same time. The zinc supports immune function. The magnesium quietly maintains over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body, including the ones governing sleep, muscle recovery, and nerve signaling. The complex carbohydrates digest slowly, providing clean, stable energy without the blood sugar crash. And it was harvested wild, not bred for maximum yield, not cultivated in depleted, synthetic fertilized soil. Wild rice from a living lake ecosystem absorbs minerals and bioactive compounds from an aquatic environment that no domesticated grain has access to. This soup kept entire nations alive through winters that would break most people today. It was not sustenance. It was medicine in a bowl. Number 5. Acorn and wild mushroom porridge. Before European contact, for a vast network of California indigenous peoples, the Miwok, the Maidu, the Pomo, and dozens of other nations, the single most important food staple on the continent was not salmon. It was not game. It was acorns. Acorns harvested every fall, stored in elevated granaries, ground into flour, slowly leached of their bitter tannins, through a patient process of cold running water, then cooked into soups, porridges, and flatbreads that fed entire communities through the year. From a nutritional perspective, modern food science is only beginning to fully appreciate what this means. Acorn flour carries a fat profile that resembles olive oil more than it resembles any grain, high in healthy monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. It provides slow-digesting carbohydrates with a remarkably low glycemic index. It contains potassium, calcium, phosphorus, and B vitamins in genuine quantities. The tannins that require leaching have their own medicinal value at appropriate concentrations. Astringent, antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and California Indigenous women developed a multi-generational mastery of the leaching process that is more sophisticated than it looks. Different acorn species required different leaching durations. They knew which was which from childhood. Paired with wild mushrooms, which add ergothioneine, a powerful antioxidant that the human body cannot synthesize on its own, this porridge becomes something extraordinary. It was the food prepared for the sick, the elderly, the very young. The recovery food. The gentle, mineral-dense broth that rebuilt bodies when nothing else could. The knowledge of how to make it nearly vanished. It deserves to be remembered. Number 6. Chokecherry and bison stew. Chokecherries grow wild across virtually every region of North America. Small, dark, aggressively tart berries that stain everything they touch and make your mouth pucker on contact. Most modern people walk right past them without a second glance. For plains and woodland nations, they were one of the most medically important plants on the continent. Chokecherries are extraordinarily concentrated in anthocyanins and proanthocyanidins, the same class of polyphenol found in blueberries and dark chocolate, but in higher densities than either. These compounds have demonstrated anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and cardiovascular protective effects across multiple clinical studies. Research on proanthocyanidins shows meaningful improvements in arterial elasticity, reductions in LDL oxidation, and measurable support for healthy blood pressure. Chokecherry stew, berries simmered low and slow with bison meat and root vegetables, was not comfort food in the modern sense. It was a medicinal preparation used specifically for digestive complaints, respiratory recovery, and post-illness rebuilding. The tannins carry antimicrobial and astringent properties historically applied to gut infections and inflammatory bowel conditions. The seeds require careful processing. Traditional techniques removed amygdalin compounds through methods passed down across generations. This was not ritual for ritual's sake. It was food safety science embedded in cultural practice, precise enough to protect communities for centuries. What modern oncology is beginning to explore in chokecherry compounds, traditional healers had already placed at the center of their recovery protocols. They did not know the mechanism. They knew the outcome. That is a different kind of knowledge, and it is not a lesser one. Number 7. Pemmican. And here we are at number 7. The one I told you about at the beginning. Pemmican is arguably the most nutritionally efficient food ever assembled by human intelligence. Developed by the Lakota, the Cree, the Blackfoot, and other Plains nations as a portable, shelf-stable survival food that could sustain warriors, hunters, and long-distance travelers through conditions where no other food was available and no resupply was coming. The construction is exact. Lean bison meat, dried slowly at low temperature to preserve the amino acid profile and enzyme activity, then ground fine and combined with rendered bison tallow at a specific fat-to-protein ratio. Dried chokecherries or Saskatoon berries folded in for carbohydrates, antioxidants, and flavor. 3 ingredients. Nori for Yidashchin. Stable for years. What that fat-to-protein ratio produces is something modern metabolic researchers immediately recognize. A food that induces nutritional ketosis. Sustained energy derived from fat oxidation rather than glucose metabolism. Warriors carried weeks of caloric requirements in a small pouch and performed at high physical intensity without the energy crashes, the inflammation, or the digestive burden that carbohydrate-dependent metabolism produces. Sports scientists studying pemmican as an endurance food have found that the combination of high-quality grass-fed tallow, rich in conjugated linoleic acid, bioavailable protein from slow-dry bison, and concentrated antioxidants from wild berries, simultaneously fuels performance, reduces exercise-induced inflammation, and delivers micronutrients in a form the body absorbs with exceptional efficiency. Arctic explorers who adopted pemmican as their primary ration consistently reported superior endurance and health over those relying on conventional European military food. The Hudson's Bay Company traded it like currency, not because it was exotic, because nothing else worked as well. 3 ingredients. The most perfect endurance food ever made. Number 8. Mesquite bean cakes. I need to pause here for a moment because what I keep encountering as I go deeper into indigenous food traditions is a pattern that deserves to be said clearly. Every single food on this list represents knowledge that was nearly erased. Not lost, erased. By federal policy, by forced relocation, by the systematic dismantling of food sovereignty that came with colonization. When nations were removed from their land, they were severed from the specific plants, the specific waters, the specific animals that made their healing traditions possible. The knowledge that survived did so because people refused to let it disappear. That context is not separate from the food. It is part of the food. Honoring these traditions means understanding that. Now, mesquite trees grow across the desert southwest and northern Mexico. Thorny, scrubby, drought-hardened trees that most people drive past without slowing down. For the Tejano Owatum, the Pima, the Apache, and other desert-adapted nations, the mesquite bean pod was a dietary cornerstone. Mesquite flour, ground from dried seed pods, is naturally sweet. Not because it is high in simple sugars. Because of a specific combination of fructose, sucrose, and galactose paired with extraordinary soluble fiber content, particularly galactamannins, that completely changes how those sugars behave inside the body. The glycemic index of mesquite flour is so low that it was traditionally administered to diabetic community members long before clinical understanding of glycemic response existed. A 2014 study confirmed what traditional healers had observed empirically for generations. Mesquite flour significantly blunts post-meal blood sugar spikes compared to wheat flour, performing at a level that rivals some pharmaceutical interventions for glucose management. It is also high in calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, and bioavailable protein. Mesquite bean cakes, mixed with water, shaped, dried, or lightly cooked, require almost no technology. They are shelf-stable for extended periods. Nutritionally complete enough for desert travel across hundreds of miles. The harshest environment on the continent grew one of the most medically significant foods on this list. The people who lived there did not just survive it. They read it correctly. They thrived. Number 9. Sunflower seed and root vegetable soup. Sunflowers are not Eastern European. They are not Russian. They are North American. Helianthus annuus was cultivated by indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and eastern woodlands for at least 3,000 years before European contact. It was a primary crop in many communities as essential as corn, and the entire plant was used without waste. Sunflower seed soup, seeds ground into a rich paste or simmered whole, with seasonal root vegetables and wild herbs into a thick, deeply warming broth, is one of the most nutrient-dense preparations on this list. Sunflower seeds are among the highest dietary sources of vitamin E in its natural food form, not the isolated alpha-tocopherol in commercial supplements. The full-spectrum tocopherol complex that comes packaged with the synergistic compounds that make absorption and utilization actually work. One serving delivers more functional vitamin even most supplements provide on paper, because the food form carries everything the isolated version throws away. Vitamin E protects cell membranes from oxidative damage. It supports skin integrity, cardiovascular health, and immune resilience. It is fat-soluble, meaning it requires dietary fat to be absorbed, and sunflower seeds supply their own fat for exactly that purpose. The package is self-contained. Nothing is missing. The magnesium content is exceptional. Magnesium deficiency underlies chronic fatigue, sleep disruption, anxiety, muscle cramping, and cardiovascular irregularity in modern populations at rates most people do not realize. A bowl of sunflower seed soup addresses multiple magnesium-dependent systems simultaneously. This soup carried Plains nations through seasons when game was scarce and the ground was frozen. The seeds stored reliably, ground quickly, cooked fast. They were the backup system that never failed. Quietly, they were the medicine no one called medicine. Number 10. Wild berry and mint healing pudding. And here we are at number 10. The one I saved for last because of everything it carries with it. Virtually every indigenous food tradition on this continent has a version of this dish. Wild berries, blueberries, huckleberries, blackberries, cloudberries, strawberries, Saskatoon berries, whatever the season and ecosystem made available, mashed or slowly simmered with wild mint, sometimes thickened with ground seeds or arrowroot into a cool, fragrant, deeply sweet preparation that looked like dessert but functioned like medicine. This was not dessert the way the modern world understands the word. Not a reward. Not a sugar delivery vehicle. This was a medicinal preparation given specifically for digestive restoration, fever reduction, and recovery from illness. Timing mattered. Who received it mattered. How it was made mattered. Wild mint, which contains menthol and related monoterpene compounds, has well-documented antispasmodic, carminative, and antimicrobial activity in the digestive tract. Clinical studies confirm that wild mint and its relatives reduce intestinal spasm, relieve bloating, and inhibit pathogenic bacterial strains in the gut. The Romans did not discover medicinal mint. Indigenous peoples of North America were using it with identical precision. Wild berries carry some of the highest antioxidant measurements of any food ever tested in any ecosystem. Huckleberries and wild blueberries in particular show ORAC scores above almost everything else measured. Their anthocyanins reduce neuroinflammation, support memory and cognitive function, protect vascular endothelium, and modulate immune response in ways clinical research is still documenting decade by decade. Together, the wild berries and the mint, this pudding was the dessert that healed. Sweet and medicinal. Satisfying and restorative. It addressed cravings while delivering compounds that reduced inflammation, supported digestion, and rebalanced the body after illness or exertion. The people who made this understood the body and the land as one continuous system. The plants that grew near the river healed the people who drank from the river. The berries that ripened at the end of summer gave back what the summer's work had taken. The knowledge of when to eat what and how to prepare it and who needed it most, that knowledge was as carefully protected as any ceremony, and it was passed down for the same reason. 10 meals, dozens of nations, thousands of years of accumulated healing intelligence that modern nutritional science is confirming one clinical trial, one phytochemical study, one microbiome analysis at a time. Here is what I need you to take away from this. The people who developed these foods were not primitive. They were scientists who used the land as their laboratory. They were herbalists who used outcomes as their textbooks. They were nutritionists who used community survival across centuries as their peer review. They observed what kept people strong across brutal winters, dry seasons, and multi-week hunts. They tested their preparations against the hardest possible conditions. They refined them across generations. They embedded the results in ceremony and story, specifically so the knowledge would not die. And then almost all of it was nearly erased anyway. The fact that we're talking about it today, that indigenous food sovereignty movements are actively revitalizing these traditions, that native food scientists are bringing ancestral knowledge back into communities that need it, that is one of the most quietly important things happening in food and medicine right now. Drop a comment below and tell me which meal from this list hit you hardest. Are you Team Three Sisters, Team Pemmican, Team Wild Berry Pudding? I read every single comment. If you're not yet subscribed, hit that button now and ring the bell. We are here every week, and we are just getting started.